welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 24, Solomon. Somewhere amidst the thick jungles of the Congo, protected by both savage beast and fearsome warrior, hidden from the world for untold centuries, are the mines of King Solomon. From deep within the earth came a seemingly inexhaustible treasure trove of gold, silver, diamonds, and gems. With such wealth, Solomon transformed his sleepy kingdom into a truly awesome sight to behold. But the ancient secret to the mine's whereabouts was lost long ago. Or so it was, until Allan Quatermain set off on his remarkable adventure. Remarkable, and purely fictional, of course. H. Rider Haggard wrote his classic adventure novel based off the accounts of King Solomon being ridiculously wealthy, even by kingly standards. How he gets that reputation, along with that whole splitting a baby in half business, is all part of his fascinating life, and it starts around 970 BC. The transition of power from David to Solomon occurred without incident or bloodshed, aside from that little display of force to make Adonijah give up. No civil wars this time, so it's definitely an improvement. Thing is though, if you want to be technical here, Adonijah really was the legitimate heir. He's older, and that's the only thing that mattered. Maybe if he hadn't ticked off Nathan and Bathsheba, he could have been king. Instead, he has to grovel for his life. Ah, fate. Although despite being spared by Solomon and told to go home, he seeks out Bathsheba to ask a request of her son. Well, request/threat. Adonijah casually reminds her that he really is the true king of Israel. However, let's make a deal. He'll renounce all claims to the throne and leave Jerusalem forever, and Solomon will grant him permission to wed Abishag, the young virgin, human space eater for his dad David. Bathsheba doesn't see anything weird about a son asking to marry his dead father's girlfriend, and brings this up to Solomon. His reaction was along the lines of, "Oh, is that all? Well, what else can I do for him while I'm at it? Invite him to poker night? Maybe a back rub? Or how about I just give him the whole stupid kingdom, Mom?" And without skipping a beat from the melodrama, Solomon jumps out of his throne and swears to Bathsheba, "May the Lord strike me down if Adonijah does not pay for this request with his life." Which is what happens. And then Joab, David's general who sided with Adonijah, is also slain. And then a guy who once threw rocks at David as well. Well, we'll talk about a temper. First impressions of Solomon are painting quite a different picture than the famously wise character we hear about. Can he really be this smart guy if his first act of business is seemingly irrational violence? Let's put it this way. Generally, if you want to remain king, then you can't have someone with a stronger claim to the throne hang around. Get rid of them permanently. Exile won't cut it. These guys always have a way of returning with an army. Imprisonment sometimes can, but it's more hassle than it's worth. So that leaves execution. But how to kill off someone and still look like the good guy? Simple. When Adonijah first begged Solomon for mercy, he was told that if he was a good person, he would not be harmed. Solomon meant that, letting him go in peace. But this business blackmailing Solomon's mom to get what he wants? No one talks to mama that way. So there's your justification for getting rid of Adonijah. Call it cunning or devious, Solomon was playing a different game than his predecessors. Unlike the ham-handed Saul or the emotional David, Solomon was a thinker. He even spoke of a dream he had where God bestowed on him great wisdom. Yeah, although how to let the people know just how brilliant he is? Sometime after the Adonijah incident, Solomon holds a feast at his palace in Jerusalem. Once everyone was happy with food and drink, he gets their attention and tells a story from the first days of his kingship. Now, as ruler of Israel, he was expected to act as arbiter for his people, following in the tradition of the Israelite judges. On this one day, two women came before him, fighting over ownership of a baby. The first woman approached Solomon and spoke. "We are sisters-in-law living in the same house, and each of us bore a child at the same time. I took care of my baby, but one night she lay on top of her own and smothered him. In her grief, she snuck into my room and switched my son for her dead son. When I woke up, I saw the evil she had done and knew this dead child not to be mine." Then the other woman spoke. "Liar! The baby you see before you is my son. The dead one is yours." The two bickered back and forth as Solomon watched the scene play out before him, pontificating as he stroked his beard. He then turned to an attendant and said, "Bring me a sword." Holding the blade, he stood up and pointed the weapon at the crying infant and said, "I will now cut the living baby in two and give each mother half of the child." The first mother was sick with horror at the thought and threw herself at Solomon's feet. "Please, my lord, give her the baby, but do not kill him, I beg of you." The other mother said, "If I cannot have the child, then neither should you. Split the baby, O king." But Solomon turned to the first mother and said, "Only the true mother would give up their child rather than see it harmed. Take your baby, God's justice has been done." The Judgment of Solomon is easily one of the most famous passages from the Old Testament and is always seen as the finest example of Solomon's wisdom. Except there is a hidden message to this tale, often overlooked through the ages, and it concerns the verse immediately following this. As written in the King James Bible, "All of Israel held the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king." Why fear? Because this is not a literal story. It's allegory, a metaphor. The characters are not what they appear. The baby represents the kingdom of Israel and Judah. The false mother is Solomon, the illegitimate king, and the true mother is Adonijah, the rightful king. Applying this into the story changes the meaning. Solomon was perfectly willing to divide the kingdom with war, the sword, unless Adonijah ceded all claims to the throne. Adonijah did that, of course, so the kingdom was safe, although those more astute audience members got the point. Don't mess with Solomon. Satisfied that his people know to respect his authority, Solomon does what rulers in this region do best, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the Lugals of Sumer: launch raids on neighboring lands. Hazor of Syria and the familiar Megiddo are conquered and taken over, brought into the fold. He also introduces new military reforms by incorporating a cavalry division with 12,000 horsemen and instituting the rigorous training of 1,400 charioteers. Although that's pretty much it for Solomon's military career. Aside from bringing chariots into Israel's military, the rest of his long reign is spent solely on domestic and economic affairs. That also includes building a small town in the middle of the Syrian desert called Tadmor. The first Israelite colonists used this oasis town as a trading post, and then later on the town would go by the new name of Palmyra, whose queen would one day challenge the Roman Empire for control of the Near East. Although in modern times it has seen gut-wrenching tragedy befall it, brought on by the evil scourge of Daesh. Solomon's foreign dealings were purely diplomatic, like how it is said that the pharaoh Suleiman of the 21st dynasty entered into an alliance with Solomon and even gave him his daughter's hand in marriage. A tremendous and unusual honor, especially considering their two people's history. Still, as a dowry, Suleiman also granted Solomon the recently conquered Philistine city of Gezer, which isn't too bad. Up north in Phoenicia, King Hiram of Tyre reaffirmed his partnership with the Israelites and ended up being a close friend to Solomon. In addition to the resources he'd continue to send, Hiram and Solomon also liked to exchange riddles and letters with each other. Their mutual admiration aside, Solomon needed to maintain close bonds with him on a political level, because Hiram had the raw materials and expertise needed to complete Solomon's 3 great building projects. Once finished, these architectural wonders would transform Jerusalem from the capital of the Israelite kingdom to the capital city of God. The first of these was to simply construct greater fortifications around the city. Not exciting, I know, and Jerusalem already has sturdy defenses, yet those weren't enough to save the Jebusites from David. Solomon resolved to not let his own citizens suffer that fate. The next project, and probably the most well-known, was the construction of the first temple, Bayit Rishon. Inspired by another dream where God granted him permission to build it, Solomon requests Hiram's aid and the Tyrian king delivers. No expense was too great for his good buddy. All the stone and lumber he needed, plus an army of expert carpenters, stonemasons, metalworkers, and sculptors. Leading this all would be his chief architect, Hiram Abiff, no relation to the king. A half-Tyrian, half-Israelite master mason who knew the secrets of mortarless stonework. The massive blocks used in the temple had all been so flawlessly polished and shaped beforehand that the workers simply needed to fit them into position, thus creating a waterproof seal. On the other side of the world, almost a millennium and a half later, the Quechua of the Andes Mountains also utilized this technique, and did so without draft animals, an even more impressive feat. Now, this requires an astonishing level of expertise in geometry and engineering, far more advanced than the current technology of the time, so naturally this was a well-guarded secret known only to Hiram of Tyre. Once the temple was eventually finished, he would later be mugged and murdered by thugs for refusing to give up his secrets. A sad end for one so gifted, although his legacy would be honored in later generations as the de facto founder of the Fraternal Order of Freemasons. But back to the temple, where the plans call for it to be approximately 8 stories tall, constructed of white stone, gold, silver, cedar, pine, cypress wood, with 2 gargantuan columns at the entrance. Solomon's gonna need a serious amount of manpower to get this thing built. And just like we've talked about before, there's only 2 ways to get people to labor on a difficult and dangerous building project. Either provide paid compensation, or enslave them. Solomon chose from both categories. For his own people, he instituted a draft, similar to Khufu's methods. You'd be paid for your time and looked after, but let's not mince words. You will work. To the Canaanite vassal states, their male citizens would be enslaved in a work cycle. 1 month of work, 2 months off, in gangs of 10,000 until construction was complete. Some of these slaves were sent off to Phoenicia, where they toiled in King Hiram's labor camps, felling trees and quarrying stone. Both Israelite and Canaanite toiled away for 7 years under taskmasters and administrators until the temple was finished. But was it worth the cost? It was described in stark detail in the Old Testament and by the historian Josephus, and following their descriptions, it must have been breathtaking to behold. Within the temple, with its enormous wooden beams and gold plates nailed to them, was a room called the Hekal, or Holy Place. Inside were numerous carved sculptures of cherubim, palm trees, and a great golden menorah, although most important was what was kept in the adjacent room. Behind a heavy purple veil was the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies. It was a square room, roughly 9 meters on each side, with a cedar wood floor and golden walls. In this darkened room, as there were no windows, 2 massive golden cherubim stood guard over the real treasure, the Ark of the Covenant. David had brought the Ark into the city, but Solomon had given it a true place of honor. No one but the high priest could enter the room, and only then on Yom Kippur. By moving the Ark into his temple, Solomon was, in essence, moving the divine closer to him. And during the grand opening of his temple, he offers up the normal prayers and blessings, as well as this interesting passage. This help which I implore of you is not just for the Hebrews only, but for any who shall come here from the ends of the world, and implore your pardon. For hereby all shall learn that you yourself were pleased with the building of this house for you, and that we are not ourselves of an unsociable nature, not behave ourselves like enemies to such as are not of our own people. The Israelites sure have come a long way from the days of Moses and Joshua. From divinely mandated genocide of anyone not one of the 12 tribes, to Solomon openly inviting foreigners to pray at his temple to Yahweh. Ah, progress. Well, let's not also forget about that 3rd building project. God's got his palace, and it's time for Solomon to have one as well. The current one is so ho-hum, and while we're at it, let's go ahead and make it bigger than the temple. Same deal as before with the workforce, and similarly constructed, all decked out in gold, silver, and white stone. His gilded throne is of special interest, however, carved from either marble or ivory, studded with jewels with 6 steps leading up to it, each one guarded by 2 lions. Now the legends also say that every time Solomon approached his throne, hands would appear and reach out and welcome him. Maybe it's by some intricate machinery? We'll never know, of course. The throne was carted off by the Babylonians in the 500s BC. Solomon's palace also functioned as a creative hub for the cerebral king, and in his many courtyards and gardens he would compose numerous psalms, proverbs, and parables, kind of like our old friend a.k.a.&n. Here's just a small sampling of Solomon's words. When there is much talk, sin is unavoidable, but he who holds his tongue is wise. He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. The prospect of the righteous is joy, but the hopes of the wicked comes to nothing. Stuff like that. It's also in these courtyards that he would entertain foreign dignitaries and visiting officials. Here we learn of an interesting story concerning a visit from Makeda, Queen of Sabah. Sabah is the same city Moses helped liberate, and is now its own empire, stretching from modern-day Yemen to the eastern lands of modern Ethiopia. This diverse land is also called Sheba, and its great wealth is derived from the spice and incense trade. The Virgin Queen Makeda, sometimes known as Bilqis or Nikual, had heard the stories of Solomon's wisdom and riches and wished to see for herself if this was true. She had also heard other stranger rumors about him, how Solomon communed with angels and jinn, forcing them to bend the knee. Well, truly that would make him a mighty king, although there was an even darker rumor about him, concerning his possession of a magic ring. It was said that in his studies he uncovered forbidden knowledge, learning to design a symbol which inscribed onto this ring granted him dominion over the demons of hell. This, they say, is the source of his wealth. But come on, who comes up with this stuff, right? Well, news was in short supply in the ancient world, and an entire desert separated their two realms. Curiosity compelled Makeda, and her caravan set out from the capital at Marib, laden with treasure. Solomon's palace was as awe-inspiring as she was led to believe, but she kept her compliments cordial and succinct. A good ruler knows not to gush too much, lest you come across as inferior. She never did learn about that ring, however, or why he keeps an old oil lamp under lock and key. But I suppose it would be rude to ask your host such questions. Instead, her interactions were mostly to test his wisdom, in the form of riddles. I'll give you an example. What when alive does not move, yet when its head cut off moves? Answer: timber used to build a ship. Alright, and one more. What is the most powerful organ of the body? Careful. Answer: death and life are in the power of the tongue. Yeah, it makes sense when you think about it. Oh, this goes on for quite some time, although her constant interrogation of his mental acuity has in turn made him completely smitten with her. Solomon interrupts her questioning to announce how she will be his honored guest tonight for a grand feast. He'll answer more of her riddles later, but also show off more of his fabulous wealth. But tricky Solomon also had a plan to woo her, seeing as how for some reason she wasn't fawning over his wonderfulness yet. He contacts the palace kitchen with instructions to make sure all dishes for the queen were to be heavily salted, spiced, and even put some vinegar in her drinks. A fairly odd request, and I'm sure she wondered why Israelite food tasted so horrible, but she politely eats it just the same. The feast lasted late into the night, and ever the good host, Solomon invites her to stay over. In his quarters, of course. She agreed to stay the night, but was offended at his suggestion. The Queen of Sabah must have her own room to maintain her royal purity. Solomon agrees, but on condition that she swear not to take anything from his palace. She struggled to contain her laughter, assuring him that the prosperity of Sabah ensures that she's not some common thief. Later that night, however, Solomon's plan took effect. Makeda awoke, totally parched, only she couldn't find any water. She searched all over for a fountain or pitcher, but nothing, until she spotted a tall, glistening jug of water in an empty bedroom. Seeing no one around, she entered the room to pour a glass when, aha! Hidden underneath the covers, Solomon grabbed her wrist. This wasn't an empty bedroom, it was his bedroom. He barks at her. Why have you broken the oath that you swore not to take anything from my house? To which she responded equal parts dry mouth and scared speechless. Is the oath broken just by my drinking water? And Solomon grinned and so fiendishly replied, Is there anything that you have seen under the heavens that is better than a cold, tall, delicious glass of water? Oh, how could she resist? Makeda withdraws her oath to stay in her own room if it means finally getting something to drink. Now sometimes things are explained in too much detail, and sometimes it's the opposite. Here, for example, we have this passage. He permitted her to drink the water, and after she had drunk the water, he worked his will with her, and they lay together. Kinda makes you wonder, huh? Or not. But the next day, the Queen of Sheba leaves, and magically, 9 months later, she's given birth to a baby boy named Bina-Lechem, also known as Menelik I, the king of which all kings of Ethiopia claim descent from, until the last of the line, Haile Selassie, was overthrown in 1974. As a young man, Menelik accompanied the queen back to Jerusalem. She wanted to convince Solomon to accept Menelik as his son and to share in his kingdom. Well, no convincing was needed, because Solomon is overjoyed to meet his long-lost son, inviting him to stay in Jerusalem and even become his heir. Much to the surprise of both his parents, the boy declines, stating that he has an obligation to his own kingdom. But even so, having a father as legendary as Solomon would go a long way back home, and he asks for a relic that might prove his lineage. Solomon grants his son's wish and orders construction of a replica of the Ark. Now, here's where myth and history gets really fuzzy, because there are 3 conflicting stories about what happens next. The first is that the queen switches the fake Ark for the real Ark, bringing it home. The second is that Menelik is the one who switches it up, and the third is that Menelik's vizier, angered at having made the huge trip from Sabah twice now, conspires to switch the Ark and does so. I'm inclined to go with the third story because, as we all know, it's always the vizier's fault. Regardless, each story has the same ending. The Ark leaves Jerusalem and ends up in Ethiopia, where, according to local belief, still rests at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in the Ethiopian city of Aksum. Don't get too excited about planning a trip, as no one but the guardian of the Ark can look upon it, and since he is sworn to never leave the church until he dies, you're not getting in. Hopefully one day in the future, the truth will finally be revealed. As Solomon grew older, he took on more non-Israelites as wives, and to make them happy, began worshipping at their temples, even constructing shrines to Canaanite deities like Astarte. Oh, we've seen this happen before. Israelite citizens are outraged at this blatant violation of the first commandment, but really incensed that he heavily raised taxes to pay for all this. But probably the worst part of it all was that Judah was exempted from this tax. Was that really a wise decision? Sure, Judah's been the only state that's remained loyal to both him and his father, but all the northern states were obviously going to resent that. And to top it all, there's dangerous grumbling from some of those Canaanite vassals like Edom and Aram. Rebellion is in the air. The fear of an uprising prompts Solomon to enact a large military buildup, adding new soldiers, officer divisions, and slingers to the army, although he wouldn't live long enough to use them. Solomon dies circa 930 BC, leaving nearly half his kingdom groaning under the weight of high taxes, conscription, and in the presence of foreign gods. The golden age of King Solomon did not go out with a bang, but with foreboding unease. His son Rehoboam takes the throne during this uncertain time, as the kingdom waits to see if he inherited his father's wisdom. Hopefully he'd correct the mistakes of the past, as long as the opulence of royalty hadn't left its mark. And because perfect timing, comes news from the Nile. Word is, the new pharaoh of Egypt, Shoshenq I, doesn't care about the alliance put in by Siamun, and is casting a greedy eye on the wealth of Jerusalem. War may be on the horizon, and that means it's time for the long-awaited showdown between Yahweh and Re, Israel and Egypt. Next time on the podcast History of Our World. For more information about the music of the ancient Hebrews featured in this episode, visit ancientlyre.com. Did you know that Michael's lyre is tuned in the just intonation of antiquity music? And since the strings are wound of pure silk, he is able to produce a crisper, more authentic sound as one might hear in the ancient world. Please support his musical efforts by purchasing his albums on iTunes, Amazon, Bandcamp, or wherever you purchase music from.